Good morning, everyone. Thanks for attending. So my topic for today is digitization and automation, but particularly in the cross-border freight movement area. I will also touch a bit on international exports and imports, but the focus for today is around cross-border freight. So, I think it's easy to start these presentations with one of these kinds of pictures. I'm sure we've seen a million of these pictures before of how cross-border trade typically looks in Africa. So, a lot of congestion, a lot of people and goods moving through the same space, and a generally sort of chaotic picture. But I actually don't want to just show a whole lot of these sort of pictures. I want to present where potentially things are moving to. So I was fortunate enough end of last year to be at the East African Community headquarters in Arusha. And this is a picture I took of a control tower or series of flat screen TVs that they have up in Arusha that is basically tracking every single transit vehicle through the East African community. They geo-fence the vehicles, so they're able to respond if there's a police incident or a vehicle goes off to dispatch either police or rescue type vehicles. So they have live tracking of every single transit cargo that moves through, and I think that's probably quite a surprise to many people if you go back to my previous picture. Each of the revenue authorities in the region, so Kenya Revenue Authority, Rwanda, Tanzania, they all have their own equivalent of this setup where they monitor the trade. Now, that's not unique to East Africa. If we look closer to home, there are pilots where something similar is being piloted in the region, in the Southern African region. And if you look recently, SARS has just implemented number plate recognitions at all the border posts in South Africa to try and automate and to speed up the flow of trucks through the borders. So this is very much where cross-border trade is moving to within Africa. And I think what's important also to understand is within the context of trade in Africa, only 2% of trade in Africa happens intra-Africa. If you compare that to the EU, maybe a slightly different environment, but that's 65%. And then what's maybe even more scary, of that 2%, 50% of that 2% happens within the SACU region. So that's South Africa, Botswana, Namibia, Eswatini, and Lesotho. So the potential for growth within the cross-border trade is tremendous. And if we don't look towards the future and how do we control this trade, we're going to end up with more of that previous picture of complete chaos at the border. So from a customs perspective, there's a couple of key drivers within customs where they're looking at trying to optimize these border processes and so on. So the first of all is trying to understand their customers better. So within the local area, if we look at the supply chain starting at the origin, going through potentially one or more transit points and then ending at destination, within each of the national spaces, customs authorities are implementing what's known as authorized economic operators programs. So these programs aim to understand the exporters and the importers, the customs brokers, the transporters that act in their area, and almost vet and audit their processes to provide them with a sort of a gold standard to say that they are vetted and then provide benefits on the back of that process. There's also trying to understand the supply chain better by getting more data sources to understand, what and corroborate. Sorry, that's a difficult word. The data that they're receiving from the exporters and importers. Then wrapped around that is we have our customs-to-customs exchanges. So the customs authorities are starting to talk to each other and exchange data. That's both transactional data about what's moving between the borders, as well as what they call mutual recognition agreements. So on the back of the AEO programs, so for example, if I'm an AEO certified exporter in South Africa, if Zimbabwe, for example, had an AEO MRA with South Africa, I would also then be recognized as an AEO status exporter, importer within Zimbabwe. And then we can provide that benefits to the exporters and importers across that whole supply chain. And what does this allow customs authorities to do? So basically, using this data that they have at their hand, instead of a customs official making a random decision as to whether to stop a truck, or he's having a bad hair day and he doesn't like your vehicle, they use enhanced risk management approaches to use this data that they have at their disposal to make risk-based decisions on basis of which trucks that they're stopping or not. This then also gives them the confidence, based on the fact that they have multiple data points, to automate and expedite clearances for certain classes of traders within the region. And also provide simplified procedures and processes for these types of traders. This is happening today, so it's not something that's not happening. That East Africa picture that I showed previously, that is also built on the back of a central customs-to-customs data exchange, where they're exchanging all manner of data between the customs authorities. And within our region, the SACU and further south into sort of Zambia and the SADC region, there are already programs up that are exchanging data between customs authorities to look and to manage what is happening in our supply chains. So coming back to us as supply chain practitioners, I think there's 4 key challenges that we experience within the cross-border supply chain. So I think the first is long lead times. We all know that the border congestion that I showed, and multiple border crossings lead to delays and long lead times compared to an equivalent sort of local transport leg. But also importantly is the inconsistency in lead time. So, it's not just that it's long, it varies from one day to other depending on whether there's customs stops, whether there's potentially regulatory processes that need to be fulfilled. No visibility. So yes, we can get visibility through tracking applications. We can get a dot on a map where a truck is. I think that's fairly prevalent through supply chains within the cross-border area. But it's one thing knowing that a truck is stopped at a border, but why is it stopped at the border? So visibility of what are those processes that are causing those, those problems, and then tracking the critical path of an order across it. High costs. So again, an equivalent transport within over the same distance within the cross-border space can cost up to 3 times even more what the same transport would in the local market. And these are driven by the long lead times, also lack of backhaul opportunities, and also a lot of unclear levies, duties, toll fees that can change from time to time, and transporters need to grapple with those challenges. Then compliance. So how do you know what your regulatory requirements are before a vehicle leaves? So often what happens is that a vehicle will leave into a cross-border transaction, and then when they arrive at the border, they will start the clearing processes and then discover that they need a permit or some process that needs to be fulfilled. And it's only at that point, and that leads often to the congestion at the border post. Then there's also keeping track of the documentation that needs to come back from a customs and compliance perspective. That's often done quite manually. The only backhaul that happens often into Africa is all the paper documents that are coming back with the truck. That is a manual process that needs to be kept track of. So as I've mentioned, although the topic of this talk is cross-border trade, I think some of these issues are mirrored within international trade as itself. So I'm sure all of you are aware of the shipping crisis that's been happening for the last 2 years, where port congestion is driving long lead times, equipment scarcity, and obviously with that, the freight costs have gone through the roof on the shipping side. What's quite interesting now, there's just been more COVID-induced lockdowns in Shanghai and in China. And they've been opened up now, but now we've got a looming strike in Germany for the ports there. So as this flood of import containers is hitting Europe, one of the major ports is being, shut down because of a potential strike. So, these things are happening on and on and on. It's not something that has passed. It's certainly not behind us at this stage. So within the South African context, we have these same challenges, but they're exacerbated slightly or somewhat by the fact that a lot of the larger vessels are being diverted north to serve the northern trade lanes, which means we get stuck with smaller vessels, which means less equipment availability, less space on vessels, and That then is made worse by the fact that our ports are often some of the worst in the world in terms of operating ability. So these is a World Bank report. It was quite in the news last year, but this is the latest one, and we still haven't really improved much on that rankings. The only interesting one is how low some of the big American ports are at the bottom of that thing, and that is really driven by those port congestions in Long Beach and Los Angeles. Okay, so a typical cross-border supply chain as we would see it. So at the top there, you've got the cargo owner, so either the exporter or the importer who's initiating the transaction. That then is moving through some kind of transport planning process, whether that's a 3PL or 4PL transport process. And then there's typically quite a lot of subcontracting that then occurs. That subcontracted transporter is then typically, again, responsible for arranging the clearing and regulatory processes at the border. And then again, often they won't necessarily use the same clearing agent on both sides of the border. So they may use one party on the export side, another party on the import side, and then if there's multiple transits, that complexity just scales up. So when things go wrong at the bottom, the cargo owner, the exporter and the importer, is so far removed from the actual reality of what's happening in the ground. And then conversely, the actual clearing agent who now needs to sort out this problem is also very far removed from the cargo owner, who ultimately owns the information and the data about the product and what it is that they're moving. A lot of these interactions between these third-party service providers happen via email or very often still manual documents, printed invoices that go with trucks. So very little digitization that's happening in this space. And then, as I mentioned, the border documents are then flowing back to the cargo owner again in a very manual process. So it basically just means that the cargo owner themselves is very far removed from the reality of what's happening, at a border crossing, and that creates that lack of visibility in the process. Okay, so just a practical example of the challenge that this creates. So what I've done is I've taken two product descriptions from real invoices that have been used to clear goods across borders. And if you could maybe have a look at the first one is it says fixed bracket 3265 IN NTV, did it in a whole lot of numbers. So that's the first product. And then the other one is a cafe set boiled duck egg. Okay, so these are product descriptions that appear on invoices that get handed to clearing agents that then need to, according to the 3 pillars of customs, classify those goods. So the first thing that they need to classify those goods against is the tariff. So customs operate under a worldwide system called the Harmonized Tariff Code, whereby you need to classify your products in a way that customs can understand. So you, as a cargo owner, you may call it a red shirt and a green shirt and a blue shirt, but customs authorities need a common way to understand that that's a shirt. And they do that through the Harmonized Tariff Code. The other key pillar for customs is valuation. So the value of the goods may be a bit easier. It's driven by the unit price of the goods. So that's a little bit easier. And then the third pillar for customs really is origin. Now, that's not necessarily the origin of the goods from where they were transported. It's the origin of the goods of where they were manufactured. And that's critical to understand that. And the reason why those 3 pillars are so important to customs is that's what drives duties and ultimately revenue for the customs authorities. And that's why it's key that we get these things right. So maybe just by show of hands, the fixed bracket 32-inch is actually a TV bracket for putting a flat screen TV on. So I don't know, maybe did anyone get that right? No, cool. And the cafe set boiled duck egg, that's actually a curtain. Yeah, I don't know if anyone guessed that right. Okay, so that just demonstrates the challenge now of a clearing agent that is so far removed from the cargo owner who ultimately knows this, now needs to make decisions about this. And what's even worse is you may take a guess of what it is, but that's one clearing agent. Another agent at another border post who's running the same cargo might make a totally different decision about what that product is. And if you go back to one of the first slides I had, remember that the customs authorities are starting to exchange data. So when you say that that curtain is a shirt on one side of the border and a curtain on the other side of the border, well, what's going to happen? Customs is going to immediately say, guys, there's a difference between what you're declaring on one side and the other, and that creates a risk point, and that's what creates customs stops. And this is reality of what's happening at the moment. Okay, so just how do we solve some of these problems? So just a step back, this is a Gartner slide just looking at a digital-first supply chain. So how can we solve some of these problems with digitization? So I think the first thing is that within the face of disruptions, companies and enterprises that have visibility, control, and agility are able to adapt to disruptions much quicker and are able to then normalize their operations out of that. So given the sort of scenario that I've painted where the cargo owner is so far removed from the realities of what's happening on the ground, even visibility is not necessarily enough. It's what about control and agility? So what do you do when something goes wrong? How do you control this process that you're so far removed from, and how do you adapt to it? And this is where digital-first supply chains solve some of these problems. So how would we then look at building a cross-border supply chain that addresses some of these issues? So the first thing is we build a control tower or managed process, if you will, of the cross-border supply chain processes. So there's a single and standardized process for all of these regulatory and clearing processes across the business. So no matter what route you're using, no matter what subcontractor you're using, that is then a single and consistent process for these transporters. Means the transporters can then focus on what they do best, and that's moving goods, not managing compliance, risk, and other things. Break down some of the silos between the different third parties, and we create integrated solutions to pass data around as opposed to manual and email documents. And I think the biggest thing that changes the mindset as well is that instead of arriving at a border post and start the customs clearing and regulatory process, which often exacerbates that cross-border congestion that you see with all these vehicles arriving and then only starting the process, before we even leave the yard, we've already pre-cleared that vehicle right to its destination. We've already figured out, excuse me, what permits or regulatory requirements are required. So we fulfilled those requirements before the vehicle leaves. And so by the time the vehicle arrives at the border post, all of those processes are complete, and they can then pass seamlessly through the border. And this fits in very well with, for example, what I mentioned earlier, where SARS is looking at using number plate recognition to speed the vehicle through the border. So if we've pre-cleared and we've fulfilled all those processes, when we arrive at the border, then we can automatically flow through the border. It also prevents that differences between clearing processes that you would have seen between different routing, different subcontractors, and so forth. We also then, through that mechanism, we're able to proactively tell what is a stoppage, if there is a stoppage, why is there a stoppage, and again, to my example, we may know that a truck has stopped at a border post based on a dot on a map because of a tracking system, but we're able to add to that, why is it stopped, what is the reason for those stops, and what's the proactive way of handling that. And then also because the documents are digitized in this process, the compliance becomes a whole lot easier in terms of managing the documentation requirements around compliance. So how does this then address some of the challenges that we identified in the first, one of the first slides? So in terms of long lead times, look, we can't solve border congestion necessarily with digitization as exporters and importers, but what we can do is reduce the delays based on pre-clearance, so letting our vehicles be pre-cleared before they arrive at the border, and then making sure that all our regulatory processes are complete before the vehicle arrives at the border. And that then also improves consistency because we know that we're not going to have any unexpected problems at the border post. Visibility, We create visibility of the process in terms of the clearing and regulatory process within the systems. And we track the critical path through the different border posts as it flows and through the critical path of the clearing times. Then in terms of addressing costs, we're able to do accurate cost estimates before a vehicle leaves. So we're able to know what is the expectation in terms of toll fees and duties and all these other myriad of taxes that might be applied. And then we can track the actual costs against that. So when we get the actual costs back, are they in line with what we expected, and actually proactively manage those costs in terms of the cross-border trade. And then lastly, in terms of the regulatory requirements, as I mentioned, we're able to flag what requirements you need to fulfill before a vehicle leaves, so that we're not guessing this problem in terms of compliance, that we know upfront what are all the issues that we might expect, and to manage those upfront. And we digitize and completely automate a lot of the clearing and regulatory processes associated with compliance, and ultimately tracking the post-shipment compliance in terms of your VAT Act, your Customs Act, and so forth, making sure that all those documentation is received and controlled. Then, as I mentioned, so we've obviously looked quite heavily into the cross-border supply chain, but ultimately what we're saying here isn't unique to cross-border. It very much resonates within any import or export process. So you'd want to extend this type of thinking across your whole supply chain. So you create a single platform ultimately to manage your exports and import processes and coordinate between the different service providers. So looking broader, freight forwarders, your customers, your suppliers, and your warehouses, shipping lines, and transporters can all collaborate on one platform. The export processes and the import processes are then driven through this platform and managed in these types of platforms. So this is where we see the ultimate vision of how these platforms look. So just some of the key learnings out of some of the implementations that we've done. So first of all, we need to break down the internal and external, or silos, between external and internal parties. I think SaaS solutions very much lend themselves to that. So software as a solution, online platforms lend themselves to that. They allow parties to collaborate online, to receive documents digitally, to provide information and receive information online. We can simplify processes as far as possible. So again, looking back to that earlier slide, break down all of these different handover points and simplify your processes, create one consistent process in that. Let the processes drive execution, and let the systems then identify problems. So instead of looking at every single order to see whether there's a problem, let the system identify when there's problems and manage those, as opposed to looking at every single order using lots of Excel spreadsheets to update the statuses of where things are. Okay, also very important, I know it's a little bit cliched saying this, but there's always this sort of three pillars to these processes. There's the technology, but there's also people and process. So again, it's pointless just automating your existing process. One does need to look at how you break down these silos, how you create a single process that's supported by the technology, and obviously then that the people that support that. I can't stress that enough. It's a really important thing in terms of making a successful project out of these. Automation, so I've mentioned within these processes, we are able to automate a lot, but automation only works on good data. So it's pointless, again, it's a little bit to the people and process type discussion here. It's pointless automating something on bad data. All you're just going to get is the wrong answer a lot quicker. And remember, this is a regulatory space, so that can mean penalties, it can mean fines, and so forth. So you really need to make sure that before you start automating, that you have a solid data set to automate off and a good process to support that too. Related to the automation is in the same way that customs authorities look at data to identify risk, within automated processes, you can also use your own data to identify risk. So, we've had examples where you've had huge custom stop based on incorrect data or incorrect processes, but you can actually build systems that proactively identify where something's going wrong or is out of expectations and use that to then alert and to stop processing. And then I kind of alluded to that on the previous slide, but again, although this talk's focus has been on cross-border supply chains, a lot of this is not unique to cross-border, and you'd want to implement some of these concepts and technologies across your entire import and export supply chain. Things like I talked about tariff and origin valuation. These are themes that will come up again and again in imports and exports throughout it. So it kind of makes sense to really look at it as a complete import and export process as opposed to just cross-border on its own. Sometimes it may make sense, depending on where your pain points are, to implement in phases, but ultimately you need to have that strategic vision of across all of exports and imports. And that's me done, I think. So thank you very much. I think I've left a lot of time for questions. So if there are any questions, please feel free.
Questions, don't be shy.
Thanks, Anton, for a good presentation. So my quick question is, obviously, doing digitalization across these, especially on the regulatory aspect, writes a lot on what happens with the customs regulators in the different countries. For example, I'll make an example for us. We're struggling quite a lot in East Africa because the HS codes, they change overnight. It's the same product. The production side hasn't changed. Everything hasn't changed, but every time, especially with the KRA, the Kenya revenue, there's always just challenges. And then the same product, when you are moving it from Kenya to Ethiopia, Ethiopia has a different sets of codes and everything else. So how can this digitalization be able to take care of that if those guys are not part of the collaboration process?
Yeah. So first, maybe two sides to that question or answer. All of the customs authorities, through their World Trade Organization sort of requirements, are mandated to provide tariff and information electronically. So all these customs authorities should be providing that information to you electronically. Unfortunately, electronically is very loosely defined, so even a PDF is deemed sufficient. And I think if you are operating in a complex environment, that's not good enough, really. I know what we do within our business. We collate the HS and tariff data from across the region, and we're able to then store multiple different tariff codes. So when I talked about pre-clearing from one leg export through multiple transits and then into the ultimate destination, you're able to then use the correct tariff code for each of those regulatory regimes. Again, just from practical experience, it's not always as simple as that. I mean, even within South Africa, or SACU, we're supposed to have what's known as a common external tariff. So, all of the SACU countries would use the same tariff code. But there are even nuances between, Namibia and South Africa and Eswatini. And those do create challenges because, you're essentially saying one thing on one side of the border and another. And we work with the customs authority to try and identify those issues and to smooth it out because it is a big trade facilitation driver. So you can digitize those processes. As I say, we collect that data. You can also use the word trade facilitation with customs authorities. They are mandated to facilitate trade, and one of those is by ensuring electronic data. So I hope that answers the question. Thanks.
Anton, based on experience in imports and exporting, there are sometimes legislation that restricts the export of materials to war-torn countries or countries that can potentially use it to incite violence, etc., etc. How do you cater for that? Because that is very real, and it's actually an international requirement that you need to declare that you're not going to export that to war-torn countries. It will not be used for anything other than intended. How do you handle that? Or don't you get experiences like that?
So the answer to that is probably broader than just the product sets that you're mentioning. I mean, any product, or a lot of products, have regulatory requirements. I mean, if you've got food, you've got standards that you need to adhere to. COVID was a great example. Suddenly, hand sanitizers needed permits that they never needed permits before. There's a constant changing in regulatory environment about what products, what standards you required. Are the products even allowed to go? So the good example is always, footwear to Nigeria is completely banned. So we keep these databases of these regulatory information where we keep it up to date, and then pre a vehicle or a ship, for that matter, being dispatched, or a container being dispatched rather, we would check to make sure that we've complied with any of those regulatory requirements, before dispatching, and making sure that we have the right permits and so on top of that. Your question is also a little bit. It's obviously also about your customer that you're sending to at the end of the day. So that's also another aspect to that. But certainly in terms of the product level, we would manage that, those regulatory requirements. So, thank you.
I've read that there's corruption at border posts. What? You didn't mention it. So what solutions do you have for that?
Look, it is reality. To be honest, what we do is ultimately throw the book at the customs officers. So there is laws and regulations that they need to follow, and we don't encourage any of our clients to involve themselves in any of that, and look, it sometimes can result in delays where that might be some of the backstories, but we'll ultimately fight it even if it means something is delayed longer, just to make sure that is handled in the correct way. So.
And your solution to collect evidence?
You can collect evidence of delays at borders, but attribute it to what, it's difficult. Yeah.
Okay. Anton, thanks for a great presentation. Over here.
Sorry. Thank you for the face.
No stress. On the journey to digitize cross-border, how are you dealing with the challenges of digitizing documentation? Because for lots of companies that do cross-border, once you figured out what your HS codes are, etc., because you're sending the same commodity over, then the industry is really around the tracking and tracing, the printing of documentation, getting it back, etc. So how do you deal with digitizing that when you get to borders and the authorities still expect the physical document and that's how they deal? How are you overcoming that challenge? And even if you haven't yet, what do you foresee is going to be the method to overcome that?
So maybe the first part of the answer is obviously we are constrained by the regulatory requirements in certain countries. So yes, there are countries that are maybe less further along in this journey, of requiring digitized documents. But where we are able to, within those regulatory frameworks, we provide all that documentation digitally and generate all that documentation digitally to those customs authorities. So we don't push documents to the customs authorities manually. We integrate those documents to them, that they have visibility of the documents on a integrated platform. But yes, we are constrained by the processes and regulatory environment of that particular customs authorities. But I think customs authorities are also very much moving away from it. Their ability, you must understand also, a customs authority also they're a constrained resource as well. As much as, we talk about, resource constraints within, the private sector, they have real resource constraints themselves. So it's not in their best interest long-term to be checking every single piece of paper, that comes across their desk. And yes, there are still some countries that are doing that, but ultimately long-term, and that's why that picture that I had of what are customs authorities doing to understand their supply chains better is so important, because that capability is what allows them to get rid of the documentation. And given that they've got constrained resources, it really is in their interest to also look at how they can leapfrog and digitize these processes and then provide that trade facilitation benefit to exporters and importers. And we wholeheartedly work with the customs authorities once they provide those capabilities, to trade in general. So, yeah.
Hi, Anton. Thanks for the excellent presentation. My name is McDonald. Just two quick questions. You mentioned that shipment visibility is still a challenge, but I would have thought that some of the tracking companies have advanced vehicle tracking systems that even allows them to monitor driver behavior. So doesn't those systems enable the customers to can have visibility of their shipments because they are able to track the trucks on a real-time basis as they traverse? And then the second one, does your cross-border digitization solution also look at rail as a viable option? Because no matter how much you can try and digitize, there's certain borders that are just a problem at certain times of the year. An example being one to cross into Zimbabwe around December. So even if you have those pre-clearance and whatever, there will still be a backlog. But if you had a cross-border rail track running through this, SADC countries, would that not be an option? Thank you.
So to answer your first question around visibility, so as I mentioned, 100% most tracking companies do know and track their vehicles. So by no means do we even profess to replace that. What we're trying to provide is the context between why. I kind of use the example of, yes, the dot on the map might be stuck at the border, but why is it stuck at the border? What can I do about it? And what is the process that's missing there? And that's the extra layer that we provide. But 100%. And also, we're providing that information back to the exporter and the importer. Whereas, again, when you're using multiple subcontractors, again, how do you as an exporter and importer, get access into those platforms? And there are ways of doing that, but that's beyond our scope a little bit. But we do see that as part of a greater kind of platform that there's real-time visibility along with the customs clearing processes and export-import processes that go with it. So those two things work in together, very much in our mind. In terms of rail, if I look at it from a regulatory process, it's no different. So we've had customers that do cross-border rail, out of, say, for example, Eswatini, out of Durban on a rail. So, from a regulatory process, it works exactly the same, and we support that as much as possible. The realities of rail, though, and that's probably beyond the scope of my discussion, it's about, is it a viable option? Is there reliability of service, security of stock is an issue on rail, especially if you high value type products. So there's a number of other issues at play with rail, that would need to be addressed before. But given that these things aren't challenges, I agree with you. There's definitely something that should be looked at in the long term. I mean, you look at what Kenya's done. They've moved a lot of their cargo onto rail. I know within the Cape Town port, we very much people are looking at using what's known as Balcon to rail, containers into the port. So there are initiatives along that, and it does make sense in the future. But it's really about the reliability of the service ultimately, beyond the regulatory issues. I think is the more important thing. So thanks.